My name is Lauren Eckerman. I work with the Secretariat of the IAIS, and you've joined us today for this public background session, which we've held a couple of weeks after beginning the consultation on our diversity, equity, and inclusion supervisory guidance. The first of two such consultations we'll do this year, and this one is on the governance, risk management, and culture perspective of the topic. You can find these slides already available on our public webpage at the stakeholder event. In this public background session today, we're going to first introduce this consultation to you by covering the background, so mentioning the broader context of the IIS's work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll also mention what is an application paper. That's the nature of this document that we're consulting on. And also, what are the ICPs, the Insurance Core Principles, which you find referenced within the application paper. We'll also clarify the timelines and the process of this consultation, and then turn it over to an overview of the contents of the draft application paper. And thirdly, we will invite your questions. When we come to this Q&A component of the session, we encourage you to please raise your virtual hand, and then we will come to you one by one, and my colleague Alka Sharma will unmute you, because on entry into this webinar, you are all automatically muted. So this is the process we'll follow at Q&A. So just to recap, you click on raise hand, and then we will one by one invite you to ask your question, and we will take you off mute. So at the moment, you would see a small red microphone icon with a line through it that indicates that you are muted. When we take you off mute, that will go away. So please speak at that moment. So let me then pass to the IIS's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Champion, Jerry Cross.
Thank you, Lauren, very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're coming to us from today. Thanks very much for joining us and for your interest in this work by the IAIS on diversity, equity and inclusion. As Lauren says, my name is Jerry Cross. I am the Director of Financial Regulation, Policy and Risk at the Central Bank of Ireland. And I'm really pleased and honoured to have been asked to champion the IAIS's work on diversity, equity and inclusion, and as to do so as part of the Ethical Committee. Kind of just bear with me, my slides have just failed me there. There we are back. So perhaps what I'd like to do is to begin, maybe just set a little bit of context around the consultation, maybe starting for those of you who are not familiar with the IAIS itself, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. We are the global insurance standard setter with insurance supervisor members from more than 200 jurisdictions, and in total that covers around 97% of global insurance premiums. The mission is a very straightforward one: to promote effective and globally consistent supervision of the insurance industry, to develop and maintain fair, safe and stable insurance markets for the benefit and protection of policyholders, and to contribute to global financial stability, all aspects of which are critical in the current context of challenging global economic conditions. Diversity, equity and inclusion is one of the 6 current strategic themes of the 2020 to 2024 strategic plan of the IAIS. And it was chosen as a strategic theme because the IAS considers that a focus on improving and sustaining diversity, equity and inclusion within the insurance sector, and indeed within supervisors themselves, really helps to build the teams, the approaches and the cultures that better support sound, prudential and good consumer outcomes. And there's at least 3 ways, you can cut it different ways, there's at least 3 ways that we think that it does this. First of all, diversity, equity and inclusion contributes to really strengthened corporate governance and risk management within insurers by improving decision making and reducing the risk of groupthink, something that was probably at the heart of the last financial crisis, and very often at the heart of less successful firms. Secondly, it helps by reducing misconduct, by creating a stronger, better, more resilient culture. And thirdly, by promoting better consumer outcomes and greater innovation by incorporating a better awareness of the needs of different types of consumers into all aspects of managing the product lifecycle and interacting with customers. So for these reasons, the IAS aims to contribute to and accelerate the momentum of action by both insurance supervisors and the industry itself to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in the insurance sector. Now, given this location of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a strategic theme, throughout last year and again this year, the IAS has been pursuing work that aims to do three things, I guess. One, to help insurance supervisors further understand the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's a really important part of the effort, to really dig into that understanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion does deliver and can deliver, also sometimes what it does not deliver. And secondly, to highlight the connection between promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the insurance sector and supervisors' mandates. And that's again a really important aspect of this, because supervisors will come across our 200 plus members and say, well, we've got a different mandate in this regard or that regard. And so trying to have that conversation and to explain how diversity, equity, and inclusion relates to the insurance supervision mandate generally has been a very important part of our work. And thirdly, to provide advice and examples on the range of available supervisory practices. And again, you'll see all of that in our discussion today. So this year, the IAIS will publicly consult on 3 draft application papers, or actually 2 drafts and 1 revised application paper linked to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Firstly, the current consultation paper prepared by the Working Group on Governance, which looks at how diversity, equity, and inclusion within an insurer's institution, within its workforce, its leadership, its culture, its decision-making, influences its governance and its risk management and its overall corporate culture. And it identifies relevant matters for supervisors to look at and potential action supervisors can take to address potential and realised diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Importantly, also, part of the overall puzzle anticipated for public consultation in Q3 are the next 2 products that we have mentioned here on the slide. The first of these, which again will be a really interesting consultation, I think, looks at Insurance Core Principle number 19. And this sets out the requirement for fair treatment of customers. That is, ICP 19 talks about how there is a requirement for fair treatment of customers. And the draft application paper will consider how implementation of this insurance core principle should be informed by an understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion in order to be effectively achieved. Where this is done, the outcomes for customers and potential customers will be enhanced. And this work has been developed by the IAS Market Conduct Working Group. And then finally, later in the year, there will be an update to the application paper on regulation and supervision supporting inclusive insurance market. In other words, how to create insurance sectors and insurance activities within different jurisdictions which are inclusive as possible. That application paper was first published in 2012 and is now being updated for further discussion. And to round out the context, this next slide looks at some key pieces of previous work on diversity, equity, and inclusion by the IAIS. Maybe worth emphasizing to this audience that the 2022 stock take report is available on the link that you will see here on the slide. It is a public output, and I think you will find it very interesting to read. I certainly always find it when we're having these discussions, going back to it and seeing the kind of that stock take of what we found when we looked at this issue for the first time, really very, very interesting. It represented our first step into diversity, equity, and inclusion, and presents the outcomes of a survey of our membership and engagement with a small sample of industry stakeholders. And it gives a very good picture of kind of where we're at, I say right now, a couple of years ago, in terms of people's understanding of how much focus they put on DEI, what their mandate is in respect of that, how much focus the industry is putting on it. And it's a really interesting and rich picture of the current landscape. So highly recommend that to you. I think it also showed that while there was good momentum in this space, there also is clearly a way to go on the journey if we're really to leverage the full benefits of the thinking and work in this space. And I think that's kind of what has galvanized the IAIS to step into this space and to do so much, I think, really valuable work in relation to it. Turning now to the maybe more specific aspects of this consultation, and maybe no harm in the slide does it really to say a little bit about what is an ICP and what is an application paper. The terminology can be a little bit recondite if you're not familiar with it. An ICP comes from the insurance core principles, and they are effectively the suite of high-level principles supported by standards and guidance which set out what supervisors are expected to adhere to in the establishment of the regulation supervisory framework within their jurisdictions. And they are a very rich and very relevant source, an up-to-date source of material for understanding what do you expect of a well-performing, well-supervised insurance sector. And then the application papers, which is specifically what we're talking about today, in other words, an application paper in relation to an ICP, these are supporting materials. They relate to a particular part or parts of the ICPs, but they're not binding in themselves. They don't create new standards. They don't create new requirements. Rather, they're a way of understanding how best to achieve the full implementation and the best implementation of the already existing standards. Finally, very importantly, and it is mentioned here, but it's important in itself, but I think particularly important in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Throughout all of this, throughout all of the ICPs and the application papers, the proportionality principle holds a very strong sway, I should say. And it basically determines that the way of interpreting and giving life to and giving effect to both the ICPs themselves and the application papers must be determined both by, if you like, the context, and particularly in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion, local context is really important, and there are very significant different local contexts, as we shall see, and also relating to the nature, scale, and intensity of the particular business work, the business model, the nature of the institution, nature of the firm, so that the principles are given effect with different levels of intensity depending on those factors. So that proportionality principle, always worth mentioning and always very important. Finally, then, before I hand over to Lisanne, let me just mention the logistics of this particular consultation. The consultation, as Lauren has said, is out there now. Feedback to be submitted, please, and we really do welcome and look forward to your submissions by the 14th of June. Please do use, in fact, you have to use, because there's no other way of doing it, the consultation tool, which we have designed to be helpful. In other words, we haven't asked specific questions in detail throughout the draft consultation paper, or the consultation paper. Rather, we have asked, we have aligned the consultation tool with the different sections and parts of the consultation paper, so it allows you to respond very helpfully and specifically on the particular topics and aspects. Finalising the paper, we would hope to be informed by your consultation feedback. We'd hope to have finalised in Q4 this year. So having said all of that, again, welcome very much to this call. Thank you for being here. And let me pass now to Lisanne Butte to present an overview of the contents of the draft application paper. Lisanne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's attending the webinar. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I am going to quickly talk you just through an overview of the draft application paper. So starting out just then with the overview of it, how the application is structured. Section 1 introduces the objective and the context of the paper and the interpretation of the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then explains the related work by the IIS and the links to ICP 7 on corporate governance and ICP 8 on risk management. Section 2 then explains why DE&I is relevant in the context of an insurer's corporate governance, risk management, and corporate culture. And then flagging at a higher level some of the risks that may arise in an insurer due to a lack of DE&I. Section 3 highlights relevant matters that supervisors could look out for and provides two non-exhaustive lists of possible warning signs that an insurer might need to work on its DE&I. Section 4 then proposes potential steps that a supervisor can take in either industry-wide or insurer-specific in response to identifying concerns related to DE&I, ranging from soft powers to more formal interventions. I think very importantly from the onset, in this paper, it's noted that the local circumstances, and particularly the legal and cultural and historical context, will influence how DE&I is considered and how the actions can be taken by supervisors and insurers in a specific jurisdiction to enhance DE&I within that sector. So moving to the next slide then. Firstly, just on the interpretation of the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion, the IIS does not seek to define DE&I, particularly because of the importance of the local, legal, and cultural context and what the role that this can play in determining what the right DE&I approach can be for an insurer. The IIS, however, in the paper sets out the interpretation of the terms for aid in understanding what the application refers to. So it's based on practices that were identified through the previous work that Jerry spoke to. I'm just going to very briefly touch on the meaning of the terms just to distinguish. Diversity is explained to be a reflection of the differences between people in an organization or in wider society. It includes different perspectives and knowledge, the ways of thinking, and then it also explains what is meant by the different demographic characteristics that could be included in diversity and different ways of thinking, importantly, which includes diversity of thought and or what's termed cognitive diversity. Equity is considered to be aimed at seeking to achieve fairness for all through allocating resources and opportunities in a way that recognizes the different circumstances and the needs for different groups of people, particularly where, for example, there's evidence of disadvantage among certain groups. The explanation also distinguishes between the difference between equity and equality. Inclusion then sits, in this context, refers to where all people in an organization, regardless of their differences, feel a sense of belonging and are unrestricted by physical or non-physical barriers and are enabled to fully participate and contribute to an organization. It also draws the links between feeling empowered to speak up and express views without any fear of negative consequences. Moving along to the next slide then. Section 2 also explains why DE&I is relevant in the context of ICP 7, ICP 8, and corporate culture, and how these elements interplay and how it leads to better outcomes in the context of corporate culture, risk management, and corporate governance. In the context of governance, it can lead to less groupthink, more robust discussion and debate, better strategic awareness of risks and opportunities, and better decision making. From a risk management perspective, it can lead to wider risk awareness with broader consideration of appropriate setting of and maintaining of risk appetite. It can also include, it leads to a consideration of all DE&I related risks, and then also effective challenge at all levels, which is very important. This can then lead to a culture that reinforces responsible and ethical behavior, values openness and debate. It can lead to good employee retention, higher productivity, and lower misconduct. The section also looks at a high level, as I mentioned, to touch on some of the risks that may arise in an insurer due to a lack of DE&I. This includes safety and soundness risks. So, for example, because of suboptimal business practices, poor decision-making, weak internal challenge, and lack of innovation. Competition risk, which would be, for example, where the business strategy may be less competitive in comparison to peers, or the product offering might be less attractive in the market. Misconduct risk, because where DE&I is poor, groupthink is more likely, and it increases the risk of inappropriate conduct occurring in an organization or perpetuating, which can lead to systemic misconduct. Reputational risk, which really is about how future employees, the consumers, investors consider the implication of a lack of an insurer focusing on embedding DE&I. Talent risk, so being less able to attract and retain the best value in a competitive labor market. And then lastly, also just legal and regulatory risk, which is the risk relating to regulatory sanctions, prosecution, or litigation when insurer engaged is in discriminatory or inappropriate practices, or by allowing them to occur in an organization. The section then just lastly also includes a box explaining what is groupthink and why it matters to insurers. So then moving on to section 3 and what supervisors should look out for. The section starts out with some consideration of relevant matters to look at when considering diversity versus equity versus inclusion. It then proceeds to provide 2 distinct lists of warning signs that an insurer might need to enhance its DE&I efforts. The first list really relates to concerns that are observable when examining governance, risk management, and corporate culture at an insurer. And this is something that all insurance supervisors do. So these and where these concerns might actually be rooted in DE&I issues. So the first set of warning signs illustrates how DE&I issues in an insurer could be causing impacts that raise supervisory concerns and how this is really relevant to all supervisors. The second list of warning signs is more where there are DE&I initiatives being implemented by an insurer that involve shortcomings or problems, or which might actually make them ineffective at driving real change. The second list of warning signs is really relevant for supervisors who already or are preparing to or considering to examine DE&I actions being taken by insurers in their specific jurisdiction. So the supervisors may observe warning signs from either one of the lists or from both kinds of warning signs. I will briefly touch on the list of warning signs in my next slide, but just before that, the section 3 also sets out 2 information boxes again. The first box that relates to what is DE&I washing, which is kind of information and which is similar to the more commonly known ESG washing, and then also a box on indicators of positive action of DE&I and insurer. So it's not the focus of the paper, but it does give some indications of where positive action can be identified in an insurer. So if we then move on to the 2 lists of warning signs, and I'm just going to very briefly touch on it to give examples. First list of warning signs relates, like I said, to governance, risk management, and culture observations that may be rooted in DE&I issues, and includes, for example, lack of challenge at board discussions and key decision-making processes, resistance to change in an organization, lack of open communication in all levels, insufficient consideration of the views of control functions, high employee attrition levels, long-term vacancy rates, and poor recruitment outcomes. And then also findings, for example, at employment tribunals or discrimination cases in favor of employees. That's very common. The second list, like I said, really sets out the signs of shortcomings or problems with embedding DE&I initiatives. So this is more relevant to supervisors, like I said, who are already or planning to examine DE&I. These could include disparaging or dismissive attitudes to promoting DE&I, a lack of DE&I efforts to drive change, for example, limited or stagnant diversity metrics, so how the diversity is measured, all talk and no substance, the DE&I washing that I referred to, poor internal communication on DE&I, lack of DE&I strategy, and then also, for example, focusing on increasing diverse representation only at senior leadership levels. So these are just some of the examples of what is set out in those lists. If we then move on to section 4, here it really sets out what the potential actions are that's available to supervisors to address D&I issues identified in an insurer. The first section sets out potential industry-wide actions, and the second section builds on that by focusing more on targeted actions that a supervisor may take with individual insurers where one or more of these warning signs are identified. Supervisors really have a range of options available to them, from using soft powers to incorporating DE&I into their supervisory approach, through to using more formal powers to create actual new requirements in this regard. The paper, however, confirms that implementing a combination of these responses would most likely drive the greatest positive impact for a supervisor. Again, the approaches must be considered in the context, in a specific jurisdictional context for the supervisor, bearing in mind the powers and the mandate of that supervisor to undertake any such action. And then the section also sets out an information box on collecting and using data as part of a D&I strategy. So this really explains that gathering and using data that give insight into the presence or not of diversity and the degree of inclusion or exclusion in an insurer can be a really powerful component of insurer-initiated D&I actions and actions by a supervisor. And this again would be relevant in jurisdictions where the supervisor has the legal remit and it's culturally acceptable to do so. Any supervisory action related to the D&I will likely be informed by the legal remit, as I said, of the supervisor, the broader legal and cultural context of the jurisdiction, and as Jerry also mentioned, the size, the location, and the nature of the insurer in question. And with that, I will wrap up my overview of the paper and hand back to Jerry to moderate the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks, Lizanne, very much for that really clear and I think really interesting summary of what's in the paper. So as Lizanne says, we come now to the Q&A session. Now we always have this, for me, kind of interesting challenge in relation to diversity, equity, inclusion, which is it's a really rich topic, and there's lots and lots of things to explore. Of course, today we're focused on the consultation paper, but we can go around the edges a little bit too. But we also find that people very often are a little bit reluctant when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion to maybe raise their hand. So I really encourage you, to take advantage of this opportunity. It is a really rich topic, and the more people can regard this as a sort of a reasonably good opportunity to share their questions, any reflections. Of course, we're at an early stage in the consultation paper, but any questions you might have, I think would be very, very welcome. Now, I do see that Anna Jarvis has their hand up, but I'm not sure if that is to ask a question. Anna, is that to ask a question?
Anna, we've taken you off mute, but we didn't hear you speak. Would you like to try again? Anna, we're not succeeding in hearing you. Perhaps what we'll do is we'll go to our next question asker, and then we'll return to Anna.
So who else would like to?
So we have David Snyder.
David.
Good evening. Can you hear me all right?
We hear you well, David, yes.
Thank you so much. First of all, diversity, equity, and inclusion is something very important to the insurance industry. So we look forward to continuing to work with our supervisors on this critical issue. I'm representing the American Property Casualty Insurance Association, but also chair of the Global Federation of Insurance Associations Governance Working Group. So these issues are very important on very many levels. And constructive engagement is where it's critically important on this issue in particular. And we look forward to working with IAIS on your further work on this in addition to this, and hope for some sort of roundtable or some sort of opportunity for interacting beyond the formal sort of paper and consultation and response elements of our interaction. A couple quick things. First of all, a question: are there particular elements of the paper or particular questions that you as supervisors would like input from stakeholders? I mean, particular questions that have arisen in doing the paper, particular elements beyond, of course, the comments that would otherwise be provided as general comments and then section by section comments. The second point or question relates really to slide 15. And as I look at some of the elements put forward there of supervisory sort of interaction with regulated insurers, there seems to be a high degree of subjectivity and the danger perhaps of too much internal connection with insurance companies, blurring the line between the regulated company and the regulator, or the supervised company and the supervisor. So I think you may hear a little bit about that. I'm not sure entirely right now how to resolve that, but there is a little bit of concern about supervisors too much interacting in the internal operations of the company rather than looking at what it's doing from the outside and assuring certain basic things are in place. Finally, the importance that the paper indicates of local legal and supervisory considerations is very, very important, because DEI may be defined differently from area to area, as well as the extent of supervisory authority. But beyond those comments, I think the most important thing I wanted to raise with you is what are the particular issues or questions that you would very much like stakeholder engagement in? And thanks again for the opportunity, and thanks for a very thoughtful paper and presentation today.
Thanks, David, very much for that thoughtful intervention. So maybe I don't know if I turn first to Becky to see whether, particularly on that question, perhaps of are there particular elements that kind of stand out a little bit in terms of where we'd like input, but also anything that you heard from David and Becky. Any reflections from your side?
So everything is okay, Lauren?
I hear you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the colleague David for those questions and comments rather also. So I think if I start from the back around local requirements, I think it's something that we focused on in a great deal and acknowledged, in the application paper that's out for consultation, that jurisdiction requirements are specific to the countries, and they maybe as a result of historical context, etc. And as a result, the definitions are different, coming from one country to another. But what we are trying to do by putting this out there is to say that, is the discussion on DEI there? Executive having the right engagement, is the board having the right engagement around issues of DEI within the context of the country that you are operating from? Now, international companies may be operating from different countries for which, there are different requirements because of the historical context. So it's important to have some kind of a base of things that, will need to be considered. And that's what we're trying to achieve by doing this. There is, on your second question, an element of subjectivity in terms of slide 15. We are trying to almost give guidance to supervisors to say, what are some of the things that you can look out for from the outside? So we are really not trying to say that supervisors should be more intrusive in terms of what they normally would do. It really is to give them some kind of ammunition on what are the things that you can look out for from the outside. And then in need be, you can then engage the institutions. You will find that some of the institutions and some of the countries are further ahead, and sometimes some of the industry is slightly ahead of regulation, and when it comes to DEI, so that is welcomed also from that point of view. So I think lastly, if I go back to the first one, particularly we are trying to make sure that there is a discussion around DEI at the right level of the organizations, and that supervisors have elements that they can look at, whether you're doing desktop monitoring on supervision or actually doing on-sites. But we're trying to make sure that we are cognizant that each of the countries are different, each of the jurisdictions are different, and as a result, that is left to the supervisor to say to what extent should they be as intrusive that they feel they need to be on matters of DEI. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Becky. Indeed, I think that's very rich insights. I don't know, Lizanne, anything you wanted to add? Any other perspectives in response to David's question?
I can certainly echo what Becky has highlighted. Maybe just in addition to the specific slide that David referred to, I very much agree that there is an element of subjectivity to it. As Becky said, I think that is the challenge with supervision by nature. But I think that for a supervisor, it's truly about what outcomes these warning signs could lead to. So it's not really about looking internally. It's about what can the result be if these warning signs are identified, and that's certainly the lens that we had a look at when the list was compiled. Thank you. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lizanne. Also, yeah, no, I think, and David, you sort of, I think you hone in on the really, one of the really core parts of the consultation and indeed of the work, and it's generally one of the challenges with diversity, equity, and inclusion to really give it that articulation, which is both proportionate, helpful, I would say, because I think fundamentally it's a very, very helpful way of addressing some of these challenges, and then also appropriately practical. So I think Becky and Lizanne have described very well kind of the thinking behind that, and of course in the consultation your reflections on that will be important. But I would say it's important not to sort of think of these as sort of prescriptive lists of kind of new requirements. As we talked at the beginning, these are application papers which are designed to help with the implementation of the sort of the more like normative standards, which are the ICPs themselves. So thanks for that. I don't know, David, does that answer your question? Any reflections on what you've heard?
I want to thank you. This sort of discussion is extremely helpful, and we're absolutely committed to working with you on this very important issue. And we're with you on this journey. So thanks again, and we do hope for significant progress in this area. And I know the companies that I'm aware of are very much committed to serving an increasingly diverse population in an effective way. So thanks again for this opportunity and others, and for the future engagement.
Thanks, David. Lauren, do we see other hands?
At this moment, we do not have any other raised hands. And I managed to chat with Anna, who has a laptop problem, which is why she couldn't be heard, but she says she does not have a question to ask. Okay, good. Yeah, I wondered whether, because the hand had come up quite early, I wondered whether it was sort of a technical glitch, which fair enough. Thank you. I mean, maybe so just while people are still reflecting as to whether they have other questions, maybe if I can put a question to Becky and to Lizanne, just maybe in relation to the next slide, to the one that David referred to, that's slide 16, and sort of the supervisory, what can a supervisor do in response? I mean, what in the work you have been leading, Becky and Lizanne, what's your reflection on how supervisors approach this matter, and sort of, is there a sort of a best practice? Do supervisors sort of build it into the things they would otherwise be doing? Do they develop specific tools and techniques around DEI engagements?
Do they develop thematic or a mixture of all? Is there a sort of an emerging way of thinking about how to approach this? Either Becky or Lizanne, come on.
Okay. I had a hand up for a different point, but I'll let Lazan answer this if you don't mind. But the point I want to highlight was on David's comments to say perhaps it may be useful to have this discussion also in a roundtable format. So David, we've heard you, and we'll take those into consideration in upcoming IIS events. But Lazan, you can come in. I'll come on after if need be. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Yeah, so just to the comment that Jerry raised, I think there is, I can certainly not say that there's a standard approach across the various jurisdictions that we've identified. I think just from our engagements anecdotally, there's certainly not been moved to very strict requirements in this regard. So I think the more common is the softer approaches. The paper actually does go to, and I didn't touch on it in my presentation, but the paper does, for example, say the type of desktop assessments that can be done, where the focus areas can be, what a supervisor can consider. So, I mean, but the range is really wide. And I do think it's probably, again, because of firstly, the legal powers. So often in various jurisdictions, you know, what is prohibited in one jurisdiction is actually law that a supervisor has to do in another. So because it's so extremely wide, the approaches also really vary. But as a general rule, I'd say, you know, more soft approaches and these types of engagements. Becky, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yes, I think you've covered it, Lazan, but just to add, especially on the legal aspect of it, is that what we are trying to do here is to say, even if, you know, from a legal perspective, there's a view that there's limitations, using some of the data that you already have as a supervisor, there can be engagement or a view that can be drawn from the information you have. Unless if your legal requirements specifically excludes, you know, DEI, which we haven't found. But certainly, I mean, all the supervisors, most of them are dealing with this slightly differently. And I think this is to say that there is some work that can be done from a supervisory perspective, at least to get an understanding at an industry level and in need at an insurer level. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thanks. And that accords very, very much, I guess, with our own local experience at the Central Bank of Ireland, where these issues have been you know, quite prominent in our agenda for the last 5 or 6 years, which is a sort of a variety of approaches, whether you roll out a thematic, for example, in 1 year, build it into your governance and culture reviews. There's a whole variety. It's one of the, I think, the powers of the sort of the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens is that you can deploy it in different ways and get really good positive sort of momentum built from that. Lauren, do we have other questions coming up?
No, we do not.
Okay. Well, I think we have done hopefully a good job, or at least Lizanne and Becky have done a good job in setting out the CP and its content and in whetting people's appetite to respond. And of course, this is all about the engagement getting really good sort of back and forward amongst stakeholders around these issues. So we really do encourage people to respond, and that is, as I've mentioned earlier, by the 14th of July, and then we'll move towards the product later in the year. I'm right, aren't I, Lauren? It's the 14th of July.
No, it's the 14th of June.
The 14th of June. I knew I was giving too long. Thank you. So the 14th of June, not the 14th of July, in case anyone's thinking they've got an extra month. Apologies, I would have lost my job straight away. Thank you, Lauren. Lauren, is there anything else we should finish on?
Simply to remind everybody that they can find the slides from today, and in due course they'll find the recording of today on the public website. Also the application paper, the list of questions, which is really just a general comments box, and then a box for you to submit your comments on each particular section or information box from within the paper. You can find that all on the public webpage.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all for joining us and for the very good session. Thanks in particular to Becky and to Lizanne and to Lauren. And I guess we will leave it there and look forward to engaging further and seeing your responses. Thank you all very much indeed, and have good continuations. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.